wasn't so set that the 20th century would be powered by gasoline and petroleum. Diesel advocated for different fuel. His was capable of delivering a much higher amount of horsepower and much more torque. Within 10 years, he's inhabiting the most revered circles of engineers in Germany. I go through all the newspaper headlines and the evidence that unfolds in the weeks after his disappearance, and there's so many twists and turns and shocking moments.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Horsepower Heritage. I'm Maurice Merrick, and greetings to all of you listening far and wide from places like Bensalem, Pennsylvania, Ypsilanti, Michigan, Denver, Colorado, Guelph, Ontario, Canada, Luleå, Sweden, and Southampton, England. Thanks for joining me, and if you're a longtime listener, then you know I like to delve into the origins of the automobile from time to time and all the technological developments along the way. Now, when you think of diesel engines, chances are you picture a Kenworth Big Rig, or a Ford Super Duty pickup, or maybe even a trusty Mercedes-Benz sedan with 1 million miles on the odometer. And those are great examples of the durability and utilitarian nature of the diesel, but how much do you know about the man who invented this workhorse power plant? I didn't know much about him myself, least of all that on the evening of September 29th, 1913, 55-year-old Rudolf Diesel disappeared from a steamship, the SS Dresden, during a crossing from Antwerp to England. And the only thing that remained was his neatly folded coat, found along the railing at the stern of the ship the next morning. It was a big story in newspapers worldwide at the time. Did he commit suicide? Was he murdered by foreign agents or by a business rival? The full story hasn't really been told until now. In his new book, The Mysterious Case of Rudolf Diesel, author Douglas Brunt plays detective and retraces the origins of this technological genius as well as his relationships with other prominent figures like Thomas Edison and St. Louis beer baron Adolphus Busch. Diesel was an engineer, but also an idealist, whose invention had huge geopolitical implications at a time when the world was on the verge of the greatest armed conflict in history up to that point. It's a fascinating story, and Doug Brunt is here to tell it. But first, just a reminder, please rate and review the podcast. It's really easy. Just tap those 5 stars, and if you're on Apple Podcasts, just jot down a sentence or two about the show. It really does help bring in new listeners. So show me some love. Let me know you're out there. All right, get ready because I've got a tale of invention and intrigue with author Douglas Brunt. It's the mysterious case of Rudolf Diesel, and that's coming up right after this. This episode of Horsepower Heritage is sponsored by Model Citizen Diecast. No matter what's in your garage, you can fit all your automotive heroes on a shelf. And they've got you covered, whether it's 1/43rd scale, 1/18th scale, or even the ginormous 1/8 scale masterpieces from the Amalgam Collection. Go to ModelCitizenDiecast.com and get 10% off when you use the promo code HERITAGE at checkout. Limitations apply. From race cars to street cars and everything in between, it's Model Citizen Diecast, because your inner child still wants to play with cars. Doug Brunt, thanks for coming on the show. Did you ever think you might end up on an automotive podcast?
I had not. That was not on my bingo card a few years ago. Although when I started this book 5 or 6 years ago, I thought one day it possibly could happen.
Well, it makes sense because Rudolf Diesel has been so important to automotive technology, but also to marine propulsion and trains and trucks. And everything in our world seems to have depended on diesel power at some point.
That's totally right. There's this one way I try to explain it is, imagine a piece of fruit grown in a tropical region. Every piece of heavy machinery and farm equipment used to grow that piece of fruit is diesel powered. It then gets loaded onto a truck. Anything larger than a passenger car, diesel powered. Goes down to the port where a crane, diesel powered, loads it onto a cargo ship. 100% of cargo ships around the world, diesel powered. Goes across the oceans to another port, offloaded onto a truck, onto a train. Throughout the 20th century, pretty much every train was diesel powered. Then it goes to a warehouse and where it's refrigerated and most inland power sources over the 20th century diesel powered, some still today. So nothing in the global economy moves without diesel.
Yeah, pretty remarkable. And yet the man himself has fallen into relative obscurity compared to other inventors of the same time period. But just to give people an idea of how far diesel engines have come in the last 100 years, I want to mention a little factoid before we get started here. The biggest diesel engine in the world is the Wärtsilä-Sulzer RT Flex 96C. Say that 5 times fast. It's 87 feet long. It's 44 feet high. It's got 14 cylinders. It turns at a maximum speed of 120 revolutions per minute, and it's 107,390 horsepower. It's as tall as a 5-story building. And the key to the diesel engine is that he realized that the heat of compression could not only start the ignition process, but maintain it and generate efficient power versus a spark ignition or a hot tube type ignition, which was kind of an old school. Mm-hmm. So we're going to get into all of it. But Doug, one more thing. I want to let people know about your podcast. It's called Dedicated with Doug Brunt. Let's talk about that for a minute. You're a novelist, but this book is your first nonfiction work, right?
Yeah. So even before I was a novelist, I was a tech executive, and I had the kind of life you do in the business world where you've got an executive team and a board and investors and customers and all sorts of things like that. And some of that I enjoyed, some I didn't love as much. I'm more of an introvert, so I love the writing side, but I do have a side of me that likes to get out a little bit and engage with some folks. So I started this podcast a couple years ago, and I know a ton of people in the writing community. And so I invite on award-winning, terrific authors. And each show opens with my guest's favorite cocktail. And I fix the cocktail right in the studio. So we've had martinis and Manhattans and champagne and you name it. And then we have a conversation about their writing process. It's not really so much focused on their latest book. It's more about their life and what are things like behind the scenes or crazy stories with book to film experiences or agents or editors and things like that. And how they do it, how they write their great stories. So Lee Child came on. He chose champagne, and we had a few glasses of champagne and talked all about Jack Reacher and what Lee's thinking about when he's doing it. We've also had on David Duchovny, who's written a number of books, and Rick Springfield, who's written a number of songs, and Amor Tolls and Scott Turow. So it's a fun way. You can browse the catalog and just find maybe your favorite author or just find someone you've never even heard of, and you'll learn a lot. It's great for readers and for anyone who's even thought about writing.
Well, I really enjoy the podcast, and I can't remember exactly how I discovered the show, but I'm always looking for interesting new podcasts, and it's got a certain relaxing quality. The conversations are thought-provoking, and it's a great break from the constant crises in the news or politics or what have you.
Oh, thanks very much. Yeah, we don't delve into politics much, and just in the way that a book can be a nice escape, this podcast, I think, can sometimes be a nice escape where you come away with a little, at least a few nuggets each time.
Yeah, I would love for people to check it out. Again, it's called Dedicated with Doug Brunt. So how did you get into this true story of Rudolf Diesel?
Well, like many folks, probably your listeners knew a lot more about diesel than I did 7 or 8 years ago, but I didn't know much. You pull into the fueling station, you see diesel incorrectly spelled with a lowercase d, should be an uppercase D, like Ford and Chrysler. And I just looked at it as like another fuel. And I didn't really recognize that the diesel engine was a fundamentally different approach to an internal combustion engine, as you know. And years ago, I bought an old boat and I was going to fix it up. I was talking to the guy at the boat yard. It was a slightly larger boat. And he was saying, what should I do to fix this up? And he said, well, you should get rid of these gasoline engines and get diesel in there. And I said, why? And he said, well, 100% of boat fires come from gasoline engines, 0 from diesel. The fuel is stable. There's no fumes. You can take a lit match and drop it into diesel fuel and nothing will happen. And you get 3 or 4 times the range out of your fuel tank. And so I did repower with diesels. And about a year later was in between novels and came across this list of mysterious disappearances at sea. And Rudolf Diesel was on the list. And I realized this is connected to these new engines I just bought. And so I followed down the events of, it's a pre-World War I story. He disappeared September 29, 1913. And I went down a 5-year rabbit hole of archives around Germany and France and the UK, and even here in the US, where there's some fascinating characters at play in the story, and then came back out with his book.
And Diesel disappeared at the absolute height of his fame.
You're right. He had just come back from his last trip to America in 1912. He made two. And he met with Thomas Edison, and he met with the Baldwin Locomotive Company and Westinghouse and all these, the heads of the United States Navy. And he was a huge global celebrity at that time. It's hard to, because the history of the man has been paved over these last 100 years, and for reasons you learn in the book, deliberately paved over. He really has been deliberately scrubbed from history. So it's hard to imagine today, but to put it in today's terms, it would be like Elon Musk suddenly disappearing overnight. That's the level of fame he had in 1913, because people were realizing that diesel was the future. And they were right about that. Diesel has powered everything, as we discussed, for the last 100 years.
Even the Ford Motor Company was courting him. They wanted to sign him on as a consultant. That's
right. And one thing we forget in today's day, that it wasn't so set that the 20th century would be powered by gasoline and petroleum. Diesel advocated for different fuels. He was looking for nut and vegetable oil or coal tar. And even Ford wasn't convinced of that. Ford and Edison were working on a very different project. In 1905, there was a fleet of hundreds of New York City taxis, and they were electric cars. There was a charging station on Broadway in Times Square. And Thomas Edison and Henry Ford were working together to build a better, more reliable electric car 120 years ago. So this is not some newfangled Elon Musk thing. Standard Oil and Rockefeller were not assured of the internal combustion engine being a gasoline-powered engine.
In fact, I think at the turn of the 20th century, if I'm not mistaken, I think it kind of broke down in thirds in terms of motive power for the automobile, at least. A third were steam-powered, a third were electric, and a third were internal combustion gasoline engines.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually gasoline won out for the passenger car. But if you needed to do heavy duty work, the diesel was the answer.
That's right. Anything that required heavier torque. As you alluded to earlier, it's a compression engine, a high compression engine. And if you go back to the days of James Watt, 1770s, which is really the first industrial capable steam engine, the metal casting technology was so rudimentary that they were sealing pipes with leather and rope and things like that. You can imagine how much pressure and heat is lost in a situation like that. By Diesel's era, when he's experimenting with his engine in the 1890s, the metal casting technology has advanced quite a bit. And he uses the highest quality metals with the most sophisticated casting. So it's a heavier engine and a more expensive engine to build than the sort of lower power gasoline engines that what we would call the Otto cycle engines that Benz and folks were using in those early cars. His was capable of delivering a much higher amount of horsepower and much more torque, that you would feel at the low end. And so his engine was great for industrial use, but also something that could bear the weight of a heavier engine, like a train or a ship. Less so these tiny little cars then that looked a little bit more like bicycles,
Yeah, all that low-end torque and also the greater efficiency compared to gasoline power.
Mm-hmm.
So when he disappeared, he was world famous, but he was actually born into obscurity to a German family that lived in Paris.
They were of Germanic origin. They were Bavarian. So at that time, the German state as we know it today did not yet exist. It was 39 different kingdoms and tribes and states. He was from Bavaria, which was one. Prussia, the leading power of the Germanic states, was another. And they had moved from Bavaria, his family, in 1850. He was born in Paris in 1858. By 1870, the Franco-Prussian War is on. So anyone of Germanic origin is basically kicked out of France. So they were not wealthy to begin with. His dad was a leather worker and a bookbinder, but they left penniless. They were, rioting and looting in the streets. They leave on a ferry bound for London with the shirts on their back. And they move into the neighborhood that is the exact setting of Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist. So you can imagine the sort of slum-like circumstances of tenement housing and smoggy, smoky factories that children are being marched into for child labor. And he arrives at the age of 12, same age as Oliver Twist, the title character. He gets a bit of a lifeline from a distant relative who offers to have him come get at least his trade school education back in Germany. So he leaves his family behind in London and goes to Augsburg, Germany, where he begins schooling. And his gifted brain and, of course, his highly motivated attitude to not have to go back to tenement housing in London, within 10 years, he's inhabiting the most revered circles of engineers in Germany.
Incredible. And He had a few benefactors. First, a man who owned a company that developed ice makers.
Yeah, Carl von Lind.
Right. And then Lind saw that Diesel was sort of destined for bigger things, and he encouraged him. And then Diesel had help from two German industrialists, Heinrich Butz and Friedrich Krupp.
Yeah, Krupp was one of the massive industrial firms in Germany that they made cannon, they made machines. It was, and it was a multi-generational company that continued on into, beyond World War II, but was heavily involved in rearming Germany before World War II. So they sponsored the first serious work to put the Diesel patent into practice from 1892 to 1897. Diesel was focused. He had the financial backing of Buzz and Krupp, as you say, and he built a series of prototypes. Finally, in 1897, had a sort of ready for prime time version of the diesel engine.
In the book, you talk about how the early working prototypes were flying apart, right? Mm. The walls were pockmarked from pieces flying around, but Diesel was convinced that his ideas would work not through trial and error, but because of his own meticulous calculations and the application of science. And he knew that the science was right and the thermodynamics made sense. What was missing was the metallurgy of the day and the quality of the castings. But once that was solved, he had an excellent, reliable power plant.
Yeah, that's a great distinction you draw there, because it goes to that meeting he had with Edison in 1912, who was the other way. So Diesel really believed that, the prize, as he would say, the prize rises from the work done beforehand. That all the analysis he'd done on the thermodynamics and his, all that calculation he'd done ahead of time to then say, all right, this is going to work. I've proved it in theory on the page. Now I need to go build it. Whereas Edison was much more of a tinkerer. He would sort of hobby around with things and, throw it against the wall, you might say, and then something would come of all the sort of work he did of tinkering firsthand, as opposed to, the preparatory work before you even step into the lab. It's a great scene in the book, too. There's so many funny moments of the two of them. They kind of butted heads more than they saw eye to eye, but the observations and the way Diesel describes the meeting, it's a very funny, interesting scene in the book.
So he's got a working engine ready by 1897, and for the next 10 years or so, diesel power proliferates, and it becomes the choice for marine engines. And factories around the world are licensing it. So you've got Great Britain involved, and France, and Russia, and the United States, of course. And he begins to amass a fortune.
He does when he releases it in 1897. Really, within probably 2 years or so, he's done several dozen licenses. And the licensing model of the time was to give the exclusive rights to manufacture and market the engine by national territory. And it's a fascinating who's who of the world at that time. In America, the license is taken by Adolphus Busch, who uses the engine to power his breweries, to pump water in his breweries and power refrigeration. He also has a separate business. So we can get into the submarine piece, which is a key piece to why there are various theories about his disappearance. But Busch has a separate business building diesels for the U.S. Navy submarine program. The Nobel family in Russia has the license. These are the brothers of Alfred Nobel, who invented dynamite, but he had two older brothers who were wealthier and more famous in their day because they essentially founded the Russian oil business. And there are people around the world who take the diesel license and proliferate this technology. The initial years right after 1897 were a little shaky. It might have benefited from another year or two in the lab under Diesel's care, because as the engine sort of went far and wide, it was hard to replicate the success in the lab that he had without either Rudolf or one of his, half dozen lieutenants there to help you along. So it was still a difficult, sophisticated engine in those early years, but people started to catch on and started to use it in very different modes, be it, in France on these shallow draft canal boats, in Russia, for a number of uses, pumping oil out of the oil fields, and for small boats, and ultimately for trains and other uses as well.
I think you really help the reader get to know the man himself in a way. And one example is that his life was shaped by that childhood experience in the grittiness of industrial England. And he saw child labor and massive pollution and dangerous factory conditions. So he wanted to alleviate all that human suffering.
That's right. That was the initial problem he was trying to solve. In the early 1880s, he made a list of intended uses for the engine, which included woodworking, stone carving, dentistry, things like that. Things more for rural economies. And at that time, if you remember, you have to imagine like the steam engine was a massive, massive thing. It had a huge furnace where you burn coal to then boil a giant vat of water into steam. The steam then moves the gears of the engine. And then you need a whole chimney and sort of funnel apparatus to get all the smoke and smog and partially burnt coal particles out of there. So it's just a massive thing that would be the size of a workshop, let alone, couldn't be a useful power source for a small rural workshop. So he was looking to help people who were artisans like his father in smaller businesses, not so centralized in urban economies, but decentralized. And so that was one of his initial goals. Of course, he did build a more powerful, more compact engine, but it was powerful enough. And over the years, it began to scale in power. The early diesels were 20 to 50, 60 horsepower. But very soon, they were able to expand that to 200, 300, and then in the thousands. So it becomes a massive source of power for big industry, big centralized urban industry, as well as big ships and ultimately implements of war.
And he wanted a fuel source that was clean burning. That's why he turned to biofuels like nut oils and so forth.
Yeah, he wanted clean burning, and he also wanted fuel that was accessible by pretty much anyone. And if you can run on vegetable oil and nut oil, if you have farmers, you can grow your own sources of fuel. You don't need to run around the world and have wars in places that have petroleum in the ground.
But in opposition to that were the big oil barons, people like John D. Rockefeller.
This was an existential threat to Rockefeller. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in 1870. By 1900, he was the richest man in the world. Over those decades, he was selling kerosene. He was in the illumination business, and gasoline was this waste product that he would throw away. Now, by the end of the century, the electric light bulb has come along. Edison and others have developed, greatly improving electric light bulbs, which have now doomed the kerosene engine, kerosene lantern. And so they're going to do to kerosene what kerosene had done to the whaling industry. We're no longer using whale blubber for lighting. And now soon we're no longer going to use kerosene for lighting. So Rockefeller's scrambling for his next market for his petroleum in the ground. Suddenly gasoline is a pretty attractive thing. It's no longer a waste product. We've got this internal combustion engine that can burn gasoline. So Rockefeller needs that to become the dominant mode of power. But along comes Rudolf Diesel saying, we don't need gasoline, we don't need petroleum at all. My engine, my compression engine can burn nut oil, vegetable oil, it can burn coal tar, or, as it is today, it can also burn a form of petrodiesel. But the diesel engine presented a really existential threat to Rockefeller, which is why when diesel disappeared in 1913, headlines around the world were not only covering the disappearance because this great man, the great inventor, had disappeared, but there were also murder theories that either Rockefeller killed him or that Kaiser Wilhelm II, the emperor of Germany, killed him. So those two sort of theories were explored in the press at that time.
And the Rockefeller theory wasn't that far-fetched, actually, because he was ruthless and he wasn't above using hired muscle like the Pinkerton Detective Agency to do his dirty work.
They were essentially, at that time, there were a few places like that. The Pinkertons, the Baldwin Felts. These agencies who were quote-unquote detectives really acted as the paramilitary wing of big business for the various trusts, whether it was steel with Carnegie and Frick or oil or tobacco or sugar. When there were strikes and labor issues, asking for the 8-hour workday, things like that, in came the detectives to keep things in line. And things often got out of hand. Concurrent with Diesel's disappearance in 1913 was the Ludlow Massacre at a mine in Ludlow, Colorado, where there was a strike, a miners' strike, and ultimately a huge gunfight broke out, and about 30 miners and members of their families were killed or burned in a conflict with in this case, it was the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency. Yeah, so Rockefeller, he meant it. There was a straight line between, what he's been doing and why the press might have suspected that he could be involved with Diesel's disappearance, given what a threat Diesel was. I mean, he was far more of a threat than the 8-hour workday.
Now, the other theory about Kaiser Wilhelm II, and he was a complex figure, but he seemed somewhat paranoid about maintaining his power, and he was trying to build an empire.
He inherited a very powerful Germany from his father. Ruled for a very brief amount of time. He was sick by the time he took the throne. So really it was from his grandfather and Otto von Bismarck. And they had, from the time of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, a couple of decades later, Germany's industry has boomed. They are one of the most powerful economies on the continent. They have the largest and most powerful land army on the continent. And he believes that in order for the German Empire to continue to grow, they need colonies around the world that can bring raw materials back to the empire. And in fairness, that's exactly the structure that Great Britain has. France, Italy, Austria, and others have colonies around the world. So he wants to do that, but feels that in order to do that, he needs a very powerful navy. And this gets to the rub with Great Britain, who has, since the time of Napoleon, dominated the seas. And as an island nation with a weak army, their strength and security has always been in the dominance of the Royal Navy. And as Germany begins to look to a more powerful navy, that threatens the existence of Great Britain. So they view that as an existential threat, Wilhelm's desire for this strong navy. And so this sparks what becomes known as the Anglo-German naval arms race, where Great Britain's building the Dreadnought and other very powerful battleships. Germany, after years of trying to catch up in the Dreadnought race, realizes they cannot. But Wilhelm also recognizes through his admirals that they can take the lead in U-boat technology. They can have the most powerful submarine fleet in the world, which really can negate the effectiveness of any surface warship. We'll just sneak up on you and sink you. So now Germany is one of the leaders in this, but every major power is scrambling for diesel power, because by 1913, everyone recognizes that the only way to have a submarine is the diesel engine. No other engine can work for it. But the diesel engine can make the submarine a terrible offensive weapon that can have the range to get out into the open oceans and control sea lanes. It doesn't have boat fires, has a stable fuel, and can make a brand new weapon that the prior century had not seen.
Actually, there's a great quote in the book that I made note of, and it was a Royal Navy official. He was dismissing the submarine because he said, "The submarine has the smallest value of any vessel for direct attack upon trade. She does not carry a crew which is capable of taking charge of a prize. She cannot remove passengers and other persons if she wished to sink one." Mm-hmm. Now, that was the naval doctrine of Horatio Nelson's era in the Age of Sail and, for example, at the Battle of Trafalgar. But that was outmoded. It was strategically and tactically obsolete by 1900.
That's right. The dreadnoughts at this time, certain admirals were very slow to come around to the idea of that, because it was considered ungentlemanly to attack someone with a submarine. Not only was it sort of a sneak attack, but you then would sink a vessel without the capability to rescue the crew or the cargo. So many in the British Admiralty thought it was sort of un-British to pursue a submarine program. But those in Germany and others in Great Britain finally did prevail. Jackie Fisher, a famous British Admiralty, said, basically war is hell, and any moderation in war is insanity. Like, if we can take them out with submarines, who cares if it's ungentlemanly? You've got to do it, because they're going to do it to us, and we've got to win the war. So he does ultimately win out, and Britain does pursue a submarine program. But Germany at this time has the lead, and so Britain is really scrambling for diesel technology. And as we mentioned earlier, there are very few people who have the real expertise to put the diesel engine into practice in that kind of environment. And Rudolf is one of the very few, and those who study with him closely in Germany.
And just so people understand, diesel submarines, they operate on diesel power at the surface, and they can also snorkel partially submerged on diesel power. But because it's an air-breathing engine, once they actually submerge, they've got to shut that diesel down, and then they operate on battery power. So they're electric under the water. And the main person who really championed the submarine for the Royal Navy was, of all people, Winston Churchill.
That's right. One of the crazy things about Churchill is we usually think about him as this World War II figure. And just before World War II, He was First Lord of the Admiralty, which is ultimately responsible for preparing the Royal Navy for war. And then, of course, in World War II, goes on to be PM. In World War I, he was also First Lord of the Admiralty. He took the office in 1911, held it to 1915. So ultimately responsible for preparing the Royal Navy. And he was a technophile. So he was always experimenting and fascinated by new technologies. He, a small sort of footnote in the book, he also is responsible for the advent of the tank. The Army didn't want to pursue it, but with all the trench warfare, he thought some land vehicle that can span, an 8-foot or 10-foot trench and be an armored vehicle would be a game changer in the war. And the British Army didn't want to pursue it. So though he was from the Navy, he kind of overstepped his bounds and called the land ship project. And he was shipping all the parts in to this secret location where they were working on building it. And even the guards didn't know what it was. So when these parts would arrive, they'd say, oh, that's for this tank that we're doing, like water tanks. And that was sort of the code name for it. And then the code name just stuck. That's why we call it the tank today. It was all part of Churchill's deception. But yeah, so Churchill and his admirals recognized early the value of the submarine, that it will be an important implement of war. And so they're in his private papers and letters back and forth to various admirals at that time, you can see his urgency and his fear that Germany is going to develop a U-boat program that far surpasses anything that Britain has, and that being an island nation, these submarines could just float off their ports. Because one of the weird things about Britain, though, even though it's an island nation, there are very few sort of calm water access ports around. And if Germany got a big enough U-boat program, they could basically bottle up all of Great Britain and starve them out, which they nearly did in World War I.
Yeah, fascinating. So by 1911, 1912, the diesel is proven, and it's essential to submarine warfare. And submarine warfare is arguably as important as like carrier warfare was during World War II.
Right.
I want to talk a little bit more about Rudolf Diesel's visits to the United States. The first visit was in 1904, and he was both fascinated and horrified by what he saw. He saw squalor, he saw raw sewage in the streets, shoddy building construction and public infrastructure, and it was chaos. And by the time he returns in 1912, things seem to have stabilized in these cities and towns he visited.
That's right. This was a great part of the research process. He had enormous, extensive diaries for each of those trips. And I actually called someone from my old high school from way, way back who pointed me to the German teacher there, German language teacher, who translated reams of material for me. And there are fascinating observations. I mean, here's a guy who's both an engineer and sort of a social theorist who comes over to America, and you see it through his eyes, and it's so fascinating. So as we mentioned, he was born in Paris, which by 1900 had an underground metro. They had a sewer system that was big enough to row a boat through. They had a city that supported millions of people built of stone and marble. And so off he comes to America, where towns in the Midwest could spring up almost overnight, everything made of wood. And one of the fascinating things about the rail system in America versus Great Britain had tons of coal. I mean, as do we, but Great Britain had tons and tons of coal, and their rail system ran on coal. In America, there were forests everywhere, so we just cut them down. Our rail system in the beginning ran primarily on wood, that was where our fuel for the steam engine on the rail. And Diesel would find these towns, and he would, in the 1904 trip, there was no sewage system. With a big rain, there'd be probably, you couldn't go down the street. There was no sidewalk. You couldn't get from block A to block B because it was like 6 inches of water and mud. And the towns in the Midwest that had sprung up so quickly were all built of wood. And the number one fear of Americans at that time was fire. Whole neighborhoods would just go up in flames frequently. And you'd see all these houses that would have a metal staircase, sort of a rickety metal staircase coming out of a second-story window, or ropes hanging off of balconies, because people knew high chance this thing's going to go up in flames. I have to figure out a fast way out of here. That's how we lived our lives then. But he also saw the potential of starting from scratch, and he loved various things. For example, in Europe, all the roads are built over the ancient pathways of Rome, and you just sort of have to fit what is there. In America, you build it wherever you want, wherever it makes the most sense. You're starting from scratch. And he loved the meritocracy of America, too. The class system in Europe sort of drove him nuts. And here in America, we didn't have that class consciousness in the way that Europe does. There are also some very funny observations, our eating habits. He'd see, my gosh, they eat so much food in all these crazy combinations. They have ice cream at almost every meal, sometimes twice a meal. And so he just had very, very funny observations. He loved our industry, though. He thought we were, paying our workers a fair wage. He thought the cleanliness, there were showers at most workplaces. He thought that our treatment of labor was far better than what he was seeing in Europe at that time. He was not a big fan of unions. He wanted workers to get a better wage, but he was sort of a utopian capitalist. Like, you'd pay him a good wage because it makes sense to pay them a good wage. Some of the union practices at that time, for his friend, for example, Adolphus Busch, with blown glass bottles, there were machines by then that could blow the bottles for you and do it more cheaply and effectively, but the unions wouldn't allow it. You had to use workers to do it by hand. And he was like, he was in the end an efficiency guy, and he found that inefficient.
Yeah, today we might call him a libertarian, I suppose. He had a certain idealism about the relationship between capital and labor. Do you think Diesel was naive in a certain way, Doug?
I wrestle with that because he's so smart and he could see around corners into the future. I think more so that he suffered from this thing that I hear in today's discussions called technical sweetness, which refers to the feeling of excitement and euphoria that an inventor or scientist can feel as they advance their technology. And that feeling of excitement can overwhelm any sense of caution. Like, should I be advancing this technology? And so the best example of this is Oppenheimer with the bomb, or we hear it a lot today with software engineers working on AI, artificial intelligence. We're just going at a breakneck pace on advancing this stuff. And not everyone, and maybe not the social engineers in particular, are saying, where is this going to lead us? And I think Diesel did have a bit of that, particularly in those early 1900s years, because there are letters that he has written from 1902 and 3 when the French and the Russians are already building diesel-powered submarines and making great advances with it. And he's still, he is a German living in Germany, and he would write to the Admiralty, the German Admiralty, and say, why aren't you guys doing this? You got to get on it. And so he was helping the French and the Russians advance the engine for submarine use, even though he knew, of course, this is a weapon with ethical questions about it. By 07, 08, he is now not so much encouraging the Germans to do it. The Germans ordered their first diesel-powered sub in 1908, but then they put the pedal down like no other. And so by the time the war begins in 1914, they have the number one submarine fleet in the world by far. But by 1908, Diesel is sort of not looking to help Germany. He's a little bit worried about the nationalism and the militarism in Germany, and has sort of made friendships with many inventors and figures in other countries.
And after all, as you describe in the book, he had established a general society for diesel engineering, which was intended to share the technology with the world and not let it be dominated by any one nation. And he was determined that it would not become a pure tool of warfare. Oh,
exactly. He recognized his life was really bookended by European war. So he recognized that there's value in having a strong military as a form of protection during this era of, social Darwinism, when people, if you need something, you need some resources that country has, you go invade and you take it. And so he recognized the value of all that. But he was more of a pacifist, and he also was not such a nationalist. He really considered himself a citizen of the world. He was of Germanic origin, but he was born in France and he lived in Great Britain. He was enormously fond of the United States. So he was much more, in his word, he's quoted in this in an American newspaper during his 1912 visit, of being a citizen of the world, and intended for peaceful uses of his engine. But that's sort of how history has gone. One of his favorite exhibits in a museum in Paris, when he was a young boy, that he would visit at this technical museum, was the Nicolas Cugnot steam car, which was one of the earliest forms of transportation under steam power. It's this 3-ton tricycle. I mean, it sounds weird to call it a tricycle, but it's a 3-wheeled thing with this enormous metal pot that would be heated. It would be able to generate speeds of the car of about 1 mile an hour, but it had the torque. It could haul cannon and other heavy loads at a very slow pace. And it was meant more for farming use for Cugnot, but King Louis wanted it for the military. So he had co-opted it to haul cannon and other things. And that sort of thing happens throughout history, where inventions are, have come to be recognized as having military value. And that's what happened with diesel as well.
I'm glad you mentioned Cugnot's tractor, because in episode 1 of this podcast, believe it or not, I talked about the very rudimentary developments of what would become the motor car. And that was one of the things I talked about. And it's the wackiest looking thing on wheels.
So, it's still in that same museum. There's this museum in Paris in the third arrondissement that used to be it was an abbey, like a religious structure converted into a museum during one of the many revolutions France had centuries ago. And that was the childhood museum that Rudolf would go. He lived about a block from it. So I went and found his childhood home, and which is very sad. It's just like this sad little plaque on a wall that says Rudolf was born here. The wall's covered with graffiti and stickers. I mean, there's no appreciation for what his contributions are. But I also did go visit that museum, and that is in the museum to this day. So what he was going to visit in the 1860s is still there, and you can go see it.
Yeah, incredible. And also, there's a working replica of Cugnot's tractor in Tampa, Florida, and I believe it's owned by a museum there, but occasionally they run it on public streets. And
oh my gosh. And at high speeds of 1 or 2 miles an hour?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the steering mechanism is crazy because it's operated by these chains that you pull, and the steam power to the front wheel it's operated by a primitive ratcheting mechanism, and it's really difficult to drive this thing. And they have to have people standing around it to keep the crowds back, because this thing does not stop quickly. No ABS on this baby.
Right.
Well, we don't want any spoilers, but as we said, in 1913, Diesel disappears at sea on a ship bound for England, and immediately there are these theories of what became of him.
Yes, so we talked about Rockefeller a little bit, that his advocacy for different fuels. In 1912, he had actually said to the newspapers, this is reported all over America, I can break the American fuel monopoly, and I don't need a law to do it. I don't need the Sherman Antitrust Act to do it. I can do it with the power of my technology. So Rockefeller's motive was clear. Kaiser Wilhelm's motive was clear as well, because Diesel was making that trip over to Great Britain because he was the co-founder and board director of a new diesel engine manufacturing company in Great Britain, whose mandate it was to build submarine diesels for the Royal Navy fleet. So Wilhelm, of course, is not happy with that. So his motive is clear. I don't want to spoil it, as you say, because as this unfolds in the book, I go through all the newspaper headlines and the evidence that unfolds in the weeks after his disappearance, and there's so many twists and turns and shocking moments. But I will say that it wasn't a suicide. When you look it up in the Encyclopedia Britannica, it says Rudolf Diesel died by suicide. That is not the case. I don't want to say more than that, but I will say there is another explanation for which I have overwhelming evidence. It's a circumstantial case. This is all he disappeared almost to the day 110 years ago. So of course there are no live witness testimony around, but it's an overwhelming circumstantial case of what happened, and it's been vetted. I have since taken the case to former FBI, former CIA, and former British intelligence, who all agree 100% about what happened to Diesel. So you can find out in the book.
I was reading the book on the 110th anniversary of his disappearance, and that was a little eerie when I realized it. And I had my own theory as I read along as to what happened to him, and I was completely off base, and I was very surprised about your conclusions. So it's a great end to the mystery. The book is called The Mysterious Case of Rudolf Diesel by Douglas Brunt. It's published by Simon & Schuster. Doug, thanks for coming on the show. This was a pleasure.
So fun. Thanks. And you'll have to email me after fact what your theory was.
I will do that.
Thanks so much.
That's all for this episode of Horsepower Heritage. Go to buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage to support the show. You can contribute as little as $2, or you can do a larger amount of your choice. And to those of you who've donated already, thank you. You guys are awesome. We're really ticking down the clock here on 2023. Not too many episodes left before the end of the year, but I will see you back here on Wednesday, November 1st for more of the people and stories behind the machines. So until then, I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.